Is David Hammer, the Executive Director of the ICA Group and a leading practitioner of employee buyouts of small businesses. He has worked in the long-term care field for over 15 years with a particular focus on supporting businesses in developing worker-centered practices to improve job quality and quality of care. So welcome, David.
So when we look at Alex Trebek, this strange woman, slightly racist picture, I'm going to introduce myself. So I'm Dave Hammer, the Executive Director of the ICA Group. I'm so happy to be here. For folks who know me, it is so great to see you. For folks who don't know me, I'm the guy who quote-unquote runs the organization that all the amazing people from ICA work with. So the people, I have the privilege of working with all of the folks from ICA. And it's just, I want to call out in particular Katrina Kazka, who put like her heart and soul into this conference, and like so around. So they asked me to start talking to you at 9 o'clock in the morning about numbers. That's, not the most fun thing in the world. So who remembers Classic Concentration, the game show? Anybody? Who doesn't remember the Classic? Okay. So the way Classic Concentration worked was,
I remember now.
you try to match things on this board. It would reveal a picture that had like a clue, and you had to figure out what that clue was, right? So we're going to start off with a Classic Concentration. I've revealed the puzzle. So what are we going to be talking about today?
The Force.
The Force? Yeah, not quite. We're going to race like you're matching the two things. Benchmarking. So there'll be some more bad jokes in it, but remember it's about numbers and it's 9 o'clock in the morning. So yeah, bad joke. So what's the point of benchmarking, right? Why do we do that? The reason we do it is because we want good jobs and we want quality care. That's why we do it. We don't do it for, we can talk about a business for all these business purposes, but the reason the business exists is for us to have good jobs and provide quality care, right? So our benchmarks, we have to always keep, when we're thinking about our business and how we're looking at our business, that's a key thing that we want to always be remembering, is how it's driving how we think about the outcomes that we want to achieve, right? And if we run our business well and we can improve and track it, then we can really achieve this objective. Right? But how do we know, right? How do we know how we get there? Well, that's how we use benchmarks. So there's two ways to look at benchmarks, right? The first is you look at your own company over time, right? So this year, last year, the year before, this month, last month, the month before, this quarter, last quarter, the quarter before, right? So you're looking at yourself backwards. Or you compare yourself to other companies, right? So when we think about kind of how we think about this stuff using these numbers, these are the two key things we want to be thinking about is how do we doing over time, how do we change over time, and how are we doing compared to our competitors, right? And the competitors or your similar companies matter a lot, right? So Cooperative Home Care Associates, big home care agency in the Bronx, right? Woo! Compare that to Golden Steps, a 20-person home care co-op in Brooklyn. Well, that's not really a good comparison, right? Those two companies are going to be, there's some things that might be similar. They have similar challenges, similar problems, But even though they're in like a similar market, totally different companies, right? So who you're comparing yourself to matters a lot. If you're comparing yourself to somebody who is playing a different game than you're playing, then you're not going to learn all the things. So understanding who you compare yourself to matters a lot. Okay. So we're going to talk about metrics versus benchmarks. So anybody who was in Ona's presentation yesterday spent a lot of time talking about benchmarks, right? And they look similar, right? Like some of them, these are all kind of horse-shaped things, but I'm going to argue that benchmarks and metrics are slightly different, right? And I would say that metrics are like the beautiful, cute little horses, and the benchmarks are the big things, right? Benchmarks are these big things, metrics are little. So a metric is a measure that helps you improve over time, something you're looking at all the time, right? So they're going to be changing, they're going to be evolving. Benchmarks, they're telling you where you are and how you're going, and they tend to be bigger, right? I'm going to argue today that for the most part, you have to think about 4 numbers as a benchmark, right? Now you can think about 100 numbers if you want, but I think you need to focus on 4, and we're going to go through them. So the 4 are revenue, right? That tells us a lot. How much money do we make? We call that top line, right? How much money is coming into the company in all of its different ways. But we also have to look at wages, right? So let's think about, we're talking about creating quality jobs, right? Well, the way we create quality, one of the big drivers of quality jobs is wages, right? It's not the only thing, it's wages, it's benefits, it's conditions, it's all of these different aspects, but a core element is wages, right? Now, home care, a big driver of cost in a home care agency is wages. So as wages go up, your expense is going to go up, or as revenue, or as wages go up, your revenue might go up as well because you're going to be charging more. But you can look at wages and get a little lost. So you also have to look at hours, how many service hours you're looking at, right? Now, let's think for a second, why isn't wages and hours, why aren't they kind of the same thing? Because of benefits, or how could they, maybe I'll ask a better question. How could wages and hours tell a different story?
We pay wages with the hours of work.
Right, so you can have a situation where if you're a state payer, or if you have a VA, or if you have even an insurance company, they could be raising the rates and raising the wages, right? And so your revenue is going to be going up, but your hours are actually declining. And so your revenue is going to be going up, but your hours might be going down, or they might be flat, right? We're going to look at our companies ourselves, we're going to find that that's true for some of us, right? That revenue's up, wages are up, hours are flat. So hours can give you a really strong indication around revenue and what it really means. And then the third piece is gross margin, right? This is how much money is left over after you pay for the care, right? So you pay wages to the caregiver, what's left over to run the business. So I think these are the 4 numbers that we need to think about. Does anybody know who this guy is?
Isn't it black and peel and monitor?
Nope.
Jamie Dimon.
It's Jamie Dimon, right? Jamie Dimon is the chairman of JP Morgan Chase, right? If he was in this room, he would say, "This guy's total moron." Like, you can't look at 4 numbers. Like, who's thinking of? He didn't even bring up a balance sheet. What kind of idiot does that? Well, the first thing he would say actually is like, "I don't believe any women who are people of color can run a business," because he's a skill man, right? Like, right? He would look at this room and say, "This stands against everything I believe," and they don't even look at balance sheets. What's wrong with them? Balance sheets are really important, right? If you're doing financial analysis, if you're looking at the value of a company, you're really trying to dig into what a company is, right? Balance sheets are really important. Who considers themselves an entrepreneur in this room? We got more hands gotta go up. You're an entrepreneur. If you're in this room, you're an entrepreneur. Come on, you gotta raise your hands. Raise your hands, you're an entrepreneur. Okay? We are all entrepreneurs, right? Finance people care about balance sheets and blah, 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 right? Entrepreneurs care about cash, and they care about revenue and the key things that drive that, right? So if you want to do a whole fancy analysis, and I'm a person who gets paid to do a whole fancy analysis, right? I do stuff like this all the time, right? But if you're an entrepreneur, you want to care about the key things, and those 4 key drivers, they're the things that are going to make you, especially if you're not in kind of this like solid maturity phase, right? So yesterday we talked about kind of this, like how companies move through this like, innovation and then growth and then maturity. We're all in that kind of innovation and growth area. We have to be focusing on the core numbers that are going to be driving our business, right? You have to think about a balance sheet, you gotta get the board to think about it, but day to day, our metrics and quarter by quarter or month by month, our benchmarks, these are the ones, all right? Oh, so this is me just saying, don't worry about the balance sheet. There's this great, does anybody know, there's this company called Y Combinator. It's like an incubator that started all these like big companies. And I listened to an interview with the founder. They started they were the venture capital firm that helped for the first seed funding for like Lyft and Airbnb. Like they're this big darling in Silicon Valley.
Yes.
The head of that company was like, I don't really know how to read a balance sheet, right? He's like putting billions of dollars. He's like, I don't really understand how it works. And I don't really care if the companies, in fact, I don't want the companies that I'm investing in, I don't want the people who show up to know how to read a balance sheet. I want them to understand the core strategy of the business. And in home care, that's revenue, hours, wages, right? And gross margin to know if you're doing it right. So we're gonna go through these quick. We don't have a lot of time. So this is the revenues of all the co-ops that we've been collecting data for. When I say we, Automatic has been doing this amazing work, collecting all this data. Not just because somebody else is working. But you can sort of see the sector as a whole has been pretty, flat in around $70 million in revenue, but the number of co-ops has gone up, right? We're 9 to 13 now. Now that's partially because we've had a lot of startups, right? And they have low revenue at the beginning. But this is sort of the sector, since 2017. When we look at like public revenue versus private pay revenue, you sort of see a different story, right? So this is once again, revenue is a key driver. Revenue is the key thing we want to understand, but if you just lump it all together, you get this kind of flat thing. If you break it out between these two different types, you tell a different story, which is, wow, we're doing a good job on private pay. Look at what we're doing, right? We're really focusing on private pay revenue, we're driving that up in these significant ways as a sector, right? And we can keep, so this is a great story, right? All right, this was supposed to come up 100 times, so that's not gonna, So this is every individual co-op that we have data for for all these years, right? And so the idea is it starts all at 0%, that's like no change, and then it's each year, it's, did you go up, did you go down? And so if you're above that black line in the middle, you went up. If you're below, you went down. So we've got a lot of co-ops whose actually their revenue has been declining since 2017, right? That we're not seeing necessarily the growth, right? So some are growing a lot, some are pretty flat, and some are going down, right? Now does this tell us the whole story? No, it doesn't. So when we look at wages, this is a great story. Let's compare ourselves to the This is looking at ourselves over the last, last 2 years. Our wages went up 85, on average, our wages went up 85 cents or 6%. That's pretty good, right? Is it where we want to be? Maybe not, maybe we want more, right? But it's good, right? So this is us looking at ourselves over time. This is the whole sector. You want to look at this for your individual co-op, right? How do you compare to the sector overall? How do you compare, over time? But we also want to look at ourselves like, how are we doing compared to conventional industries, right? We're paying higher than the conventional industry, right? Not by a hugely significant amount, but not by an insignificant amount either, right? So co-ops, right? We're paying higher wages than the conventional competitors. So when you look at like kind of a deeper dive, so this is individual co-ops, right? That are not named, but they're individual co-ops compared to the conventional average wage in their market, right? So we look at your market and then the conventional industry in your market. So if you're in, Dulles, we look at how much you paid, and we look at the average wage in Dulles and compare. So some were higher, others were lower, right? And some were like pretty darn close, right? So the details matter a lot as well when you get into the weeds of it. So let's look at ours, right? We saw revenue, a bunch of companies had revenue that went up, right? Over time, they were above this black line. Here, you got a lot of companies whose hours are declining, right? So revenues are flat or going up, but their hours are declining because, and the reason, the revenue can go up is because the rates we're getting paid by the by the state or by our insurance companies, we're charging the market, we're able to raise rates. That's pushing up revenue, but we're not necessarily adding more hours, right? And this doesn't tell you the whole story because you also want to look at like hours per client and how that works. That's a metric. So this is a benchmark, like, our hours are going down, our hours are flat. So we need to examine this by using metrics. We want to drive this up. How do we think about what are the metrics we could use to drive this up? Well, it might be hours per client. It might be how many, if you're a rural area, what's the driving time? All these different factors that you might want to look at to understand why this is happening, right? But this is not like, oh, everything is great, right? We need to have hours stable or growing, right? That's how we create stability, right? We think about job quality. A key element of job quality is stability. If our companies aren't stable, then the jobs that our members own, their jobs become less stable, right? So it's really critical for us to be paying attention to this, these kind of things. And if we just look at revenue, this could get lost, right? Which is why we have to think about all these different elements, and how they interact with each other. So this is the average hours per day, 2017 to 2022. And so this is only looking at co-ops with fewer than 40,000 total hours. But you can see this is sort of, even though it's, the average hours per day, right? That's pretty flat, right? 43, 40, 44, right? It's in this sort of low 40s, right? But it must be the case that on net, we're having fewer cases or doing something else that's driving down those things, right? So it's this interaction between these things really matter, right? And you want to look at this number for your co-op, the total hours for your co-op, and see like, what is the story we're telling here? And how can we do something about it? Is it helping us grow good jobs? Is it helping us build stability? Is it helping us be better caregivers? Maybe, great. Let's keep doing more of it. Is it not? Okay, what do we change? And so finally, gross margin. So this is the median gross margin for co-ops versus conventional industry, 2020 to 2022. And you can see our gross margin is less than the conventional industry every time, right? Now, who knows what's a gross margin? Who knows what a gross margin is? Raise your hand. All right, so I'm going to talk about what a gross margin is because it's a really simple but critically important number, right? So gross margin is the best way to think about it is like an hour of care, right? So let's say we have an hour of care we charge a client $30 an hour for an hour of care, right? We pay a caregiver a wage, right? Let's say we pay that caregiver a wage of $21 an hour, and let's say we then have we have to pay FICA and Social Security and workers' comp and all of these sort of other stuff. And so maybe that 21 bumps up to like $24, $25 of the total cost, right? So you take the $30, you subtract the 24, what's left over, that's 6, that's your gross margin. So the company has to take that $6, the money that's left over, and aggregate it all the little hours, every hour you do, take the $6 that's left over, and sometimes it's going to be $6, sometimes it's going to be $12, sometimes it's going to be $4, right? You aggregate those all together, and that's how much money you have to run your company, right? So you take 6 times, 10,000 hours, and that's going to give you enough, you got to pay your rent, all your admin folks, all the, your website, all your data services, you've got to pay everything you run the company out of your gross margin, right? So it's a really important number. So what's the deal with it, right? So it's what's left over, we talked about. The world will tell you a higher gross margin is better. That's what people will tell you. Higher gross margin is better since you're making more money, right? You've got more money, pay the labor, you've got more money left, you got the rest left over, right? They're just like, this is like, the more you have left over, the better off, because you can pay that to shareholders, right? Well, who are the shareholders in a co-op?
The members.
The labor, right, the members. So maybe a higher gross margin is better, maybe a lower gross margin is better. There's not a right answer, right? But understanding what your strategy around it is really critical. So it can be, a low gross margin could be good, right? So if you have if you're more efficient, right? You used to do everything by hand, and now you use a computer. It used to take you 12 hours, and now it takes you 1 hour, right? That's less cost, right? So you can lower your margin, and that you can put that money back into wages. You can put that money into patronage. So usually, like we said, keep the gross margin the same and pass any savings onto the shareholders. You can decide to lower your gross margin and put that into wages, or to keep the gross margin higher and put it into patronage, right? That's a choice you get to make. So we bring it all together. Revenues, they need to be sufficient, right? That means stable, stability, revenue stability, right? We want our revenues to be rising at least as fast as inflation, right? Because if our revenues are $1,000 every year for 10 years, $1,000 in 10 years is worth less than it was 10 years ago, right? So you want to be raising at least, because if you're flat with inflation, you're actually shrinking, right? So we got to be thinking about that. Wages, right? What is our goal? Family sustaining wages with benefits, right? This is driven by bill rates, which is driven by policy. So we want to be paying attention to this stuff. Even if you're private pay, it's driven by policy, right? Medicaid kind of sets the wages for the market writ large. Hours, this is the key unit of what we sell. We sell hours, right? If we're going to be gross and be like, what's the widget? Our widget is an hour, right? That's what we sell. And the gross margin, this really is sort of an unfiltered assessment of how the company's going. So these 4 numbers, and we're not going to, nobody's leaving this room saying, oh, I know all this stuff, everything is perfect, Dave did such an amazing job, now I know how to do all this stuff. That's not the purpose of this, right? The purpose of this is to say, these 4 things, if you're not paying attention to these 4 things as a board, if you're not looking at this stuff, right, then you're probably not paying close enough attention to the business, right? You've got to be paying attention to these things, right? Now, level 2, level 3, start getting to, there's 25 different ways to analyze this. There's other things. There's like that, balance sheet that we might want to look at. Like all that stuff is real. but when we start, just starting on these like very core things, right? Because it's hard. So we want to take the first step. These things we can know. Like not only are these really important, but they're easy to figure out, right? You can take your income statement and you can answer almost all of these questions except for hours, right? So one piece of paper can answer most of 3 of these 4 questions. The hours, if you know your average bill rate, you can also figure it out, from that same one piece of paper, right? So one piece of paper and knowing what your average bill rate, you can answer all of these questions, right? So it's simple, but really, really, really important, right? And we can start by doing a million things, and if we try to do a million things, we will fail, we will stumble. Let's focus on the core things, and then add on things that matter as it works out. So, I said only 4 things, but there's more. You guys are amazing. Right? This is not a mic. Look at this turnover, right? Pink is conventional turnover. The yellow is your turnover, right? How do you define quality care? It's the relationship between the caregiver and the client. That's what quality of care is. Like, all that other stuff. It's the relationship between the caregiver and the client. That's what quality home care is, right? How do you make that quality better? You keep the same damn person talking to that client all the time, right? Well, they can't, because those workers are like, I'm treated terribly, and they leave. You can, because your members stay. There is one thing that says home care is like good quality. Turnover is the biggest driver of that. And every single year, we blow conventional companies out of the water. We're bigger. We're better. Right? And when we get bigger, we'll be bigger and better. That's not it. Tenure, right? How long do people stay at the companies, right? It's better. I don't know what happened, but it's better. We're also better on that. So that was shown was the median and the average. There's 2 ways to look at tenure, right? How long people have been there, right? So it's the median and the average, and it's growing and it's high, right? So that's another key thing. Turnover is an important measure, but how long? Perfect. Right? So it's how many years, because it's years, looking at, right? So we're growing, right? Our tenure is growing, which means people want to stay at our co-ops. That is everybody. Who has a problem with turnover? We all have problems with turnover. Who has a problem with retention? We all have problems with retention. But you are creating jobs. You are creating companies where workers who own their job stay. And that means that job, they have the ability to grow, and it means that the quality of care is just that much better, right? So there's problems. We need our revenues to go up. We need our margins to be better. We need our wages to be higher. We need to be more effective, more efficient. We have problems as a sector. We are not the best companies in the world when it comes to running our businesses. Right? We've got to get better. We're good, but we got to get better. We're in this room together to get better. But we're starting on third base because we are better companies than conventional industry. We should all be so proud. All right. Well, if there's any questions, we have 5 minutes for questions.
I've been wondering about private care versus public care in terms of the tenor of the client, because that really drops numbers down in private
Yes.
care. And also in private pay, I think a lot of people wait till pretty much towards the end of their life to start care. And I think that might be a difference in public pay. And I've been wondering about this in my mind, and I'm wondering if you have any ideas or statistics on that.
I don't have a lot of data on it, right? So the question is the sort of the difference between private pay and public pay in terms of when folks start and how long it takes, how long it takes to get into. So I don't have great data on it. I will say, I think it's important to understand private pay is not a monolith, right? Because what you're getting at is like, oh, there's different people at different stages. Some private pay people in like spend down, right? They're just like, they need care, and they're in a spend down period to get to Medicaid, right? So they're just trying to, get rid of all their money, right, sadly, so that they can qualify for Medicaid. That's a different kind of private pay client than somebody who's got long-term care insurance, or somebody who's independently wealthy, or somebody who is like, needs a little bit of care and is sort of like early, doing it earlier as like a small amount versus needing it, more. So it's really important to understand like who your clients are and how to break those folks up into different categories. But I don't have great data. I don't know if anybody else has sort of a better answer to that.
Yeah, the client tenure data really starts to fluctuate between private and public, but it's also,
The client tenure data really starts to fluctuate year over year, and honestly, we decided not to include it because there's so many variables that kind of influence a client's tenure at any one cooperative that the cooperative oftentimes doesn't have control over. So whether or not it's a measure of the cooperative, it really doesn't have a place in this presentation. It will be in the report, yeah.
We have one more question.
So this is probably more to Ona, who's doing
Yeah.
all of the data analysis.
Right, the person who did the work, not just the guy who answers.
So I noticed in the average hours slide that it was co-ops with 40,000 hours or less. How does that skew that statistic in terms of it being like what seems like a higher end?
can you go to that slide?
Also, we need the mic for the recording, Christy.
Well, did you finish your question?
Okay. Yeah, so this slide, right, it's based off of co-ops that have 40,000 or less hours, right? And that's, to me, that's a good hour case if it's on average 42 hours. So I'm like just trying to think about that statistic and how using the co-ops with lower hours impacts the overall average number. And then if there's something about, like the type of hours that those are. Does it change? Does it concentrate it in private or public?
Well, that's average hours per day, not per client, not per case, right?
Yes, this is this is all the hours that the co-op is doing. I walk away from the This is the average hours that the whole co-op is doing. So it's not including big co-ops because you would skew, because Cooperative Home Care Associates gets caught into this because you've got so many more. It would basically be like, what is CHCA doing, right? Like, because your average would be so much bigger. We could have done median, but this is for a smaller agency. How many hours are you doing in a given day, not by client? Yeah, so it's aggregate of all. So that's a really important clarification. Thank you.